At length, with a mad anguish in my heart, I quickly opened my eyes. My dreadful thought was thus confirmed. The blackness of eternal night surrounded me. It seemed to me that the intensity of the darkness oppressed and suffocated me. The atmosphere was intolerably heavy. I continued to lie quietly and made an effort to use my reason. I remembered the inquisitorial proceedings, and from this I tried to deduce my true position. The sentence had been pronounced, and it seemed to me that a long interval of time had elapsed since then. Yet not for a moment did I imagine that he was really dead. Despite all the literary fictions, such an idea is absolutely incompatible with actual existence. But where was I and what was my status? He knew that those sentenced to death frequently died in autos de fe. The same afternoon as the day of my trial, a solemnity of this kind had been celebrated. Had they taken me, perhaps, back to my dungeon to await the next sacrifice that was to be celebrated months later? From the beginning I understood that this could not be. The contingent of victims had been immediately summoned. On the other hand, my first dungeon, like all the cells of the condemned in Toledo, was cobbled and there was some light in it. Suddenly a horrible idea rushed my blood in torrents to my heart, and for a moment I fell back into my numbness. Coming to myself, in one motion I was up on my feet, shaking convulsively in every fiber. Wildly, I stretched out my arms above my head and around me, in all directions. I did not feel anything. Still, I trembled at the thought of taking a step, but I was afraid of tripping against the walls of my grave. Sweat broke out from all my pores, and in thick cold drops it stopped on my forehead. At length the agony of uncertainty became intolerable, and I advanced cautiously, arms outstretched and eyes wide, hoping to catch a faint ray of light. I took a few steps, but everything was empty and black. I breathed more freely. At last it seemed clear to me that the fate that had been reserved for me was not the most dire of all. And then, while I cautiously continued advancing, 1,000 vague rumors about the horrors of Toledo were confused en masse in my memory. Strange things were told about these dungeons. I had always believed that they were fables, but, nevertheless, they were so strange that they could only be repeated in a low voice. Should I die of hunger, in that subterranean world of darkness, or what more terrible death awaited me? Knowing too well the character of my judges, I could not doubt that the result was death, and a death of choice bitterness. What it would be, and the time of its execution, were the only things that worried and bewildered me. My outstretched hands found at last a solid obstacle. It was a wall that seemed to be built of stone, very smooth, damp and cold. I followed her closely, walking with the cautious distrust that certain ancient stories had inspired in me. This operation, however, gave me no means of examining the dimension of my dungeon, for I could turn round and return to the point from which I had started without noticing how perfectly the same wall appeared. In view of this, I looked for the knife that I kept in one of my pockets when I was taken to court. But it was gone, for my clothes had been exchanged for a suit of coarse serge. In order to perfectly verify my starting point, I had thought to stick the sheet in some small crack in the wall. The difficulty, however, was quite easy to solve, and yet at first, owing to the disorder of my thought, it seemed to me insurmountable. I tore a strip from the hem of my dress and laid it on the floor to its full length, forming a right angle to the wall. Groping my way around my dungeon, at the end of the circuit I would have to find the piece of cloth. At least, this was what I believed, but I hadn't taken into account either the dimensions of the cell or my weakness. The ground was wet and slippery. Staggering, I walked for some time. Then I tripped and fell. My great weariness made me decide to continue lying down, and sleep did not take long to take possession of me in that position. When I woke up and stretched out my arm, I found a loaf of bread and a pitcher of water by my side. I was too exhausted to reflect under such circumstances, and drank and ate greedily. Some time later I resumed my journey around my dungeon, and laboriously managed to reach the piece of cheesecloth. By the time I fell I had already counted 52 paces, and from when I resumed walking until I found the cloth, 48. So I measured 100 paces in all, and supposing that 2 of them constituted a yard, I calculated the circumference of my dungeon at about 50 yards. However, he had bumped into numerous angles in the wall, and this made it impossible to guess the shape of the cave, for there was no doubt that it was a cave. He took no great interest in these investigations, and was certainly discouraged. But a vague curiosity impelled me to continue them. Leaving the wall, I decided to break through the surface of my prison. At first I proceeded with extreme caution, because the floor, although it seemed to be made of a hard material, was treacherous due to the silt that was on it. However, after a while I managed to cheer up and began to walk safely, trying to cross it in a straight line. In this way I advanced 10 or 12 steps, when the torn piece that remained of the border caught between my legs, causing me to fall violently on my face. In the confusion of my fall, I did not at first notice a circumstance that was not very surprising, and which nonetheless, seconds later, still on the ground, caught my attention. My chin rested on the dungeon floor, but my lips and the top of my head, though they seemed to be set lower than my chin, rested nowhere. It seemed to me, at the same time, that my forehead was drenched in a viscous vapor and that a strange smell of rotten mushrooms reached my nose. I reached out and shuddered, discovering that I had fallen to the very edge of a circular pit the extent of which I could not measure at the time. Touching the walls just below the curb, I managed to tear off a piece of stone and let it fall into the abyss. For a few seconds I paid attention to their rebounds. In his fall he crashed against the walls of the well. Lugubriously, it finally sank into the water, raising shrill echoes. At the same instant a noise was heard above my head, as of a door being opened and closed almost at the same time, while a faint ray of light suddenly pierced the darkness and was immediately extinguished. I saw clearly the fate that was in store for me, and congratulated myself on the opportune accident that had saved me. One more step, and the world would not have seen me again. That death, prevented in time, had that same character that I had considered as fabulous and absurd in the stories he had heard about the Inquisition. The victims of his tyranny had no alternative but death, with its cruel physical agonies or with its abominable moral tortures. This last one was the one that had been reserved for me. My nerves were worn down by long suffering, to the point that the sound of my own voice made me tremble, and I considered myself by all accounts an excellent victim for the kind of torture that awaited me. Trembling, I groped my way back to the wall, determined to let myself die rather than face the horror of the wells that my imagination multiplied in the darkness of the cell. In another state of mind, I would have had enough courage to put an end to my misery in one fell swoop, throwing myself into one of those abysses, but at that time I was the most perfect of cowards. On the other hand, it was impossible for me to forget what I had read about those wells, of which it was said that the sudden extinction of life was a hope carefully excluded by the infernal genius of the one who had conceived them. For some hours the agitation of my mind kept me awake. But finally, I fell asleep again. When I woke up, like the first time, I found a loaf of bread and a jug of water next to me. I was consumed by a burning thirst, and in one gulp I emptied the pitcher. There must have been something about that water, because as soon as I drank I felt an irresistible desire to sleep. I fell into a deep, death-like sleep. I have never been able to know how long it lasted, but, when I opened my eyes, I could distinguish the objects that surrounded me. Thanks to a strange sulphurous clarity, the origin of which I could not discover at first, I could see the magnitude and aspect of my prison. I had been very wrong about its dimensions. The walls could not be more than 25 yards in circumference. For a few minutes this discovery disturbed me greatly, childish indeed, for, given the terrible circumstances that surrounded me, what less important thing could I find than the dimensions of my dungeon? But my soul took a strange interest in trivial things, and tenaciously I dedicated myself to realizing the mistake I had made when taking the measurements of that room. At last the light of truth appeared to me like a flash of lightning. In my first exploration I had counted 52 steps until the moment I fell. At that moment I must have been 1 or 2 paces from the piece of cloth. Actually, he had almost made the circuit of the cave. So I fell asleep, and when I woke up, I must have necessarily retraced my steps, thus creating a circuit almost double the real one. The confusion in my brain prevented me from realizing that I had started the turn with the wall on my left and ended it with it on my right. I had also been wrong about the shape of the enclosure. Feeling his way, he had found several angles, deducing from them the idea of a great irregularity, so powerful is the effect of absolute darkness on the one who comes out of a lethargy or a dream. The angles were simply the product of slight depressions or hollows that met at unequal intervals. The general shape of the enclosure was square. What I thought was masonry now seemed to be iron or some other metal arranged in enormous plates, the seams and joints of which produced the depressions. The surface of that metallic construction was grossly smeared with all kinds of hideous and repulsive emblems, born of the sepulchral superstition of the friars. Figures of demons with menacing gestures, skeletal shapes and other images of the most realistic horror filled the entire length of the walls. I realized that the outlines of those monstrosities were clear enough, but that the colors seemed stained and spoiled by the effect of the humidity of the environment. I then saw that the floor was made of stone. In its center was a circular well, from the mouth of which I had escaped, but I did not see that there were any more in the dungeon. All this I saw confusedly and not without effort, for my physical situation had changed greatly during my sleep. Now, on his back, he was lying full length on some kind of very low wooden frame. It was tied with a long strap that looked like leather. It coiled in various turns around my limbs and my body, leaving only my head and my left arm free. However, I had to make a violent effort to reach the food contained in an earthenware dish that had been left on the ground beside me. With real terror I realized that the jug had disappeared, and I say with terror because an intolerable thirst was devouring me. I believed then that the plan of my executioners consisted in exasperating this thirst, since the food that the dish contained was cruelly salted meat. I raised my eyes and examined the roof of my prison. It stood at a height of 30 or 40 feet, and closely resembled, in construction, the side walls. In one of its faces a figure of the most singular caught my attention. It was a painted representation of time, as it is customary to represent it, but instead of the side it had an object that at first sight I thought was an enormous pendulum like those of old clocks. However, there was something about the appearance of that machine that made me look at it more carefully. As I was looking directly at it, looking up, for it was positioned exactly over my head, I thought I saw it move. A moment later my idea was confirmed. Its swing was short and therefore very slow. Not without some distrust, and, above all, with strangeness I observed her for a few minutes. Tired, after watching his annoying movement, I turned my eyes to the other objects in the cell. A slight noise caught my attention. I looked at the ground and saw some huge rats crawling across it. They had come out of the well that I could make out to my right. At that moment, as I watched them, they surged up, hastening, with hungry eyes and drawn by the smell of meat. It took me great effort and attention to push them away. Half an hour passed, perhaps an hour, for I could measure time only imperfectly when, again, I raised my eyes upon myself. What I then saw left me stunned and surprised. The path of the pendulum had increased by almost a yard, and, as a natural consequence, its speed was also much greater. But mainly, what impressed me the most was the idea that I had visibly dropped. You may imagine with what horror I then observed that its lower end was formed of a crescent of shining steel, about a foot long from horn to horn. The horns were pointed upwards, the lower edge evidently sharp as a razor. It also looked like a straight razor, heavy and massive, and it flared out from the edge into a broad, solid shape. It was fitted to a thick copper rod, and all of it hissed as it moved through space. There was no longer any doubt as to the fate that horrible monastic ingenuity had prepared for me. The agents of the Inquisition had foreseen my discovery of the well, of the pit, whose horrors had been reserved for so reckless a heretic as myself, of the well, image of hell, considered by opinion as the ultimate tule of all punishments. The most fortuitous of accidents. He had saved me from falling into it, and I knew that the art of turning torture into a snare and a surprise constituted an important branch of that fantastic system of mysterious executions. Apparently, having failed my fall into the well, it was not part of the demonic plan to throw myself into it. Therefore, he was destined, and in this case without any alternative, to a different and sweeter death. Sweeter. In my agony, thinking of my singular use of this word, I almost smiled. Why count the long, endless hours of horror, more than death, during which I counted the vibrating oscillations of steel? Inch by inch, line by line, it gradually descended, making a noticeable descent only at intervals that were to me longer than centuries. And more, more and more, it kept going down, going down. Days passed, perhaps many days, before it swayed close enough to me to fan me with its acrid air. The smell of sharp steel hurt my nostrils. I begged heaven, tiring it with my pleas, to make the steel descend faster. I went mad, I became frantic, I made an effort to get up and go to meet that terrible and moving scimitar. And then suddenly a great calm came over me and I lay smiling at that shining death, as a child might smile at a precious toy. Then a moment of perfect insensibility passed. It was a very short interval. Coming back to life, it did not seem to me that the pendulum had descended an appreciable height. However, it is possible that that time would have been very long. I knew that there were infernal beings that took note of my fainting and that at their whim they could stop the vibration. Coming to myself, I felt unspeakable malaise and weakness, the result of severe starvation. Even among those anxieties, human nature begged for sustenance. With a painful effort I stretched out my left arm as far as my bonds would carry, and seized a little surplus which the rats had deigned to leave me. As I brought a piece to my lips, a formless thought of strange joy, of hope, lodged in my spirit. However, what was there in common between me and hope? I repeat that it was a formless thought. Often man has such thoughts, which are never completed. I realized that it was a thought of joy, of hope, but I also understood that he had died at birth. I tried in vain to complete it, to recover it. My long sufferings had almost completely annihilated the ordinary faculties of my spirit. I was an imbecile, an idiot. The oscillation of the pendulum was carried out in a plane that formed a right angle with my body. I saw that the blade had been arranged so as to pierce the region of the heart. I would rip the fabric of my suit, then come back and repeat the operation over and over again. In spite of the great dimension of the curve traversed about 30 feet, more or less, and the hissing energy of his descent, which might even have cut through those iron walls, all he could do, in short, and for a few minutes, was to rip my suit. And in this thought I stopped. I dared not go beyond him. I insisted on it with a sustained attention, as if with this insistence I could have stopped the descent of the blade there. I began to think about the sound it would make when it passed over my suit, and the strange, penetrating sensation that the fabric rubs against the nerves. I thought about all those things, until my teeth gnashed. Lower, even lower. He slid lower and lower. I took frantic pleasure in comparing his up and down speed with his lateral speed. Now to the right, now to the left. Then it would go away, away, and then return, with the squeal of a damned soul, to my heart with the stealthy gait of the tiger. I howled and laughed alternately, as one idea or another dominated me. Lower, invariably, inexorably lower. It moved 3 inches from my chest. Furiously, I violently tried to free my left arm. He was free only from elbow to hand. I could only move my hand from the plate that had been placed next to me to my mouth, only this, and with great effort. If he could have broken the bonds above the elbow, he would have grabbed the pendulum and tried to stop it, which would have been like trying to stop an avalanche. Always lower, incessantly, inevitably lower. I was breathing with real anguish, shaking at every vibration. My eyes followed the upward flight of the blade, and its fall, with the ardor of the most maddened despair. Spasmodically, they closed at the moment of descent on me. Even if death had been a relief, oh, what an unspeakable relief! And yet I trembled with all my nerves at the thought that it would suffice for the machine to descend 1 degree for the sharp and shining axe to fall on my chest. And my nerves trembled, and made my whole being shrink with hope. It was hope, hope still triumphant on the rack, which made itself heard in the ears of those sentenced to death, even in the dungeons of the Inquisition. I verified that 10 or 12 vibrations, approximately, would put the steel in immediate contact with my suit, and with this observation the condensed and acute calm of despair entered my spirits. For many hours, for many days, perhaps, I thought for the first time. It occurred to me that the strip or strap that tied me was made of a single piece. He was bound with a continuous ligature. The first bite of the crescent blade, anywhere on the strap, had to untie it enough to allow my hand to unwind it from my body. But how terrible was, in this case, its proximity. The result of the slightest jolt was to be deadly. On the other hand, would the executioner's henchmen have foreseen or prevented this possibility? Was it likely that in the course of the pendulum the ligatures crossed my chest? Trembling to imagine my feeble hope frustrated, the last one, really, I raised my head enough to get a good look at my chest. The strap crossed my limbs closely, along with my entire body, in all directions, except in the path of the murderous blade. I had not yet let my head fall back into its first position, when I felt something shine in my spirit that I could only define approximately by saying that it was the unformed half of the idea of freedom that I have already expounded, and of which I vaguely describe. A single half had floated in my spirit when I brought food to my burning lips. Now, the whole idea was there, weak, barely viable, almost indefinite, but, finally, complete. Immediately, with the energy of despair, I tried to put it into practice. For several hours near the easel on which I was lying there had been an incalculable number of rats. They were tumultuous, daring, voracious. Their eyes fixed on me, as if they were waiting only for my immobility to prey. What kind of food, I thought, has he gotten used to in this pit? Except for a small part, and despite all my efforts to prevent it, I had devoured the contents of the plate, but in the long run the mechanical uniformity of that motion had made it less effective. That plague, in its voracity, left marks of its sharp teeth on my fingers. With the remnants of the oily and pungent meat that still remained, I vigorously rubbed my restraints as far as I could, and done so I withdrew my hand from the ground and stood still and breathless. At first the suddenness of the path and the cessation of movement made the voracious animals startle. They turned away in alarm and some returned to the well. But this attitude did not last more than an instant. I had not counted in vain on his gluttony. Seeing me motionless, one or two or more daring ones climbed up the ridge and sniffed at the strap. All this seemed to me the prelude to a general invasion. A new throng arose from the well. Holding on to the wood, they scaled it and hundreds jumped on my body. Nothing frightened them the regular movement of the pendulum. They dodged it and actively worked on the greased strip. They squeezed moving and piled on me incessantly. I felt them writhing around my throat, their cold muzzles seeking my lips. I was half suffocated by that weight that was constantly multiplying. A dreadful disgust, such as no man in the world has felt, swelled my chest and chilled my heart like heavy vomit. One more minute, and I realized that in more than one place they had to be cut. With a superhuman resolution, I continued immobile. I had not made a mistake in my calculations. My sufferings had not been in vain. I felt afterwards that I was free. In pieces, the strap hung around my body. But the movement of the pendulum was already taking place on my chest. The serge of my suit had been pierced and cut through the shirt. It made 2 more oscillations, and a sharp pain shot through my nerves. But the moment of salvation had arrived. At a gesture from my hands, my liberators fled tumultuously. With a calm and determined movement, prudent and oblique, slow, and flattening myself against the bench, I slipped out of the embrace and the strip and the reach of the scimitar. At least, for the moment he was free. Free! And in the clutches of the Inquisition. As soon as I had escaped from my bed of horror, as soon as I had taken a few steps along the floor of my dungeon, the movement of the infernal machine ceased and I heard it go up, attracted towards the ceiling by an invisible force. That was a lesson that filled my soul with despair. Undoubtedly, all my movements were spied on. Free! He had escaped death under a certain agony, only to be delivered to something worse than death itself, and in another new form. Thinking about it, I convulsively fixed my eyes on the iron walls that surrounded me. Something strange, a change which at first I could not clearly appreciate, had clearly taken place in the room. During several minutes in which I was distracted, full of dreams and chills, I was lost in vain and incoherent conjectures. For the first time I realized the origin of the sulphurous light that illuminated the cell. It came from a crack half an inch wide, which ran round the dungeon at the base of the walls, which thus appeared, and indeed were, completely cut off from the floor. I tried to look through that opening, though, as you might imagine, to no avail. When I woke up discouraged, the mystery of the alteration that the cell had suffered was suddenly revealed to my intelligence. He had had occasion to see that even when the outlines of the figures painted on the walls were sufficiently clear, the colors seemed altered and blurred. Now they had just taken on, and were taking on at every moment a surprising and most intense brilliance, which gave those fantastic and diabolical images an aspect that would have made steadier nerves than mine tremble. Demonic pupils, of a sinister and ferocious vividness, glared at me from 1,000 different places, where I had not previously suspected any to be found, and they shone like the lugubrious glow of a fire which, though vainly, I wished to consider entirely imaginary. Imaginary. It was enough for me to breathe to bring a reddish iron vapor to my nose. A suffocating odor spread through the dungeon. Every moment a deeper ardor was reflected in the eyes fixed on my agony. A darker red spread over those hideous bloody paints. I was panting, he was breathing heavily. There was no doubt about the desire of my tormentors, the most ruthless and demonic of all men. I stepped away from the burning metal, heading for the center of the dungeon. Faced with that destruction by fire, the idea of the coolness of the well came to my soul like a balm. I flung myself towards its deadly edges. I directed my gaze towards the bottom. The glow of the inflamed vault illuminated its most hidden cavities. Nevertheless, during a moment of madness, my spirit refused to understand the significance of what it saw. Finally, that entered my soul, by force, triumphantly. It was burned into my shaken mind. One voice to speak. Oh horror! All the horrors, except that one. With a cry, I turned away from the curb, and, hiding my face in my hands, wept bitterly. The heat was rising rapidly, and I raised my eyes once more, trembling in a feverish fit. A second change had taken place in the cell, and this was evidently effected in the form. Like the first time, I tried in vain to appreciate or understand what was happening. But they didn't leave me long in doubt. The Inquisition's revenge was swift, and twice he had thwarted it. He couldn't fight any longer with the King of Fear. The cell had been square. Now he noticed that 2 of his iron angles were acute, and therefore the other 2 were obtuse. With a growl, with a low moan, the terrible contrast was rapidly increasing. In a moment, the room had turned its shape into that of a diamond. But the transformation did not stop here. I didn't want or expect it to stop. I would have reached red-hot walls to apply them against my chest, as if they were a garment of eternal peace. Death! I said to myself. Any death, except the one in the well. Senseless. How could I not understand that the well was necessary, that unique well was the reason for the hot iron that besieged me? Would I resist his heat? And even supposing I could resist it, could I hold up against its pressure? And the rhombus was crushing, with a speed that left me no time to think. Its center, placed on the line of greatest width, coincided precisely with the open abyss. I tried to back away, but the walls, as they joined, pushed me forward with irresistible force. Finally there came a time when my body, burned and twisted, found barely room for it, barely room for my feet on the prison floor. I struggled no more, but the agony of my soul expressed itself in a loud and prolonged cry of despair. I realized that he was hesitating on the curb, and I turned my eyes. But here is a noise of human voices. An explosion, a hurricane of trumpets, a mighty roar like 1,000 thunderclaps. The walls of fire rushed back. An elongated arm took me from mine, when, already fainting, I plunged into the abyss. It was the arm of General Lassalle. French troops had entered Toledo. The Inquisition was in the power of its enemies.